The veteran's grandson was born deaf, until a girl from church did the impossible through faith. "Please, Lord, let him hear me," whispered the young woman on the porch, her hand trembling against the boy's ear as thunder cracked over the fields. Dawn rolled across the bluegrass hills of Kentucky, brushing the land with golden light. The American flag flapped lazily above a white farmhouse that had weathered better days. Inside, the faint rattle of an old clock broke the quiet that hung like fog. Henry Miller, a retired Army sergeant, sat by the window with coffee gone cold. Across the table, his 10-year-old grandson Eli bent over a sketch pad, lost in silence. Eli's pencil danced across the page, drawing fields, tractors, and a waving flag. He had never heard the sound of his own laughter, yet his drawings seemed to sing. Born deaf, the boy had known only the music of light and motion. Henry watched him, pride and sorrow tangled in his tired eyes. No doctor, no prayer, no pleading had ever given the child a single sound. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wet earth and hay. The farm stood proud, but weary barn leaning, fences bowed, tools rusted from years of use. Henry's back ached from decades of labor, yet he refused to quit tending the soil. Discipline had built his life, the same discipline that buried his grief beneath stoic calm. He still kept his son's folded uniform on a chair by the window, untouched since the funeral. Every morning began the same: coffee, silence, and the weight of memory. He spoke little, prayed less, and trusted nothing he couldn't hold in his hands. When he looked at the flag on the porch, he felt both pride and punishment. He'd served a nation that took his boy and left him an orphaned child to raise. Faith had once been his armor, now it felt like an empty word carved on a tombstone. Eli's laughter was invisible but alive, a bright spark in the dim farmhouse. He communicated through drawings, gestures, and light that filled every corner. Henry understood him without sound, though sometimes he wished for one word, just one. The boy's innocence softened the old man's bitterness like sun melting frost. But even love, Henry feared, could not heal what heaven itself had ignored. By noon, sunlight spilled through the fields in long golden lines. Eli chased butterflies near the fence, while Henry mended a gate. Their rhythm was quiet but steady, like two hearts beating in different worlds. Neighbors drove by, waving politely, before disappearing down the dusty road. Henry tipped his hat out of habit, never expecting company to stop. When evening came, he sat on the porch beneath the waving flag. The air cooled, the crickets sang their hidden chorus. Eli sketched again by lantern light, his pencil tapping gently like distant rain. Henry stared into the fading horizon, thinking of his son's voice he'd never hear again. He whispered a prayer he didn't believe in, just in case someone still listened. The sky darkened, and thunder rolled far away beyond the hills. The house creaked, alive with memories older than the boy inside. Henry rose, turned off the porch light, and glanced once more at the flagpole. The cloth snapped in the wind, strong, defiant, unbroken. He nodded to it as though saluting a comrade that refused to fall. Night settled soft and heavy. Henry watched Eli sleeping, small hands curled beside the sketchpad. He thought of miracles, how they belonged to other men, other stories. But something deep in his chest stirred, quiet as a heartbeat. It felt like faith, though he wouldn't dare name it yet. Sunday morning rose gray and still, the kind that carried memory more than promise. The church bell rang across the valley, echoing through mist and farmland. Henry dressed in his best coat, starch worn thin from years of funerals and Sundays. He buttoned Eli's shirt, brushed his hair, and led him to the old pickup. The engine coughed to life, carrying them down the gravel road toward town. The white-painted church stood proud on the hill, its steeple piercing low clouds. Inside, wooden pews groaned beneath families who had known each other forever. Whispers followed Henry the way smoke follows fire, soft, familiar, impossible to escape. "Poor man," someone murmured. "That boy still can't hear a thing." Henry pretended not to notice, guiding Eli to the last pew near the door. The preacher spoke about faith that hears even when heaven seems silent. Henry kept his hat in his lap and his heart behind a wall. He no longer bowed his head when prayers began. He simply stared at the cross. Each word felt like a hammer against stone that would not crack. Beside him, Eli drew another flag, red and blue, swirling in holy concentration. Rain began to tap the stained glass, each drop streaking color across the light. The congregation swayed with the hymn, voices trembling but sure. Henry's lips did not move. The war had taken his voice long before age did. He wondered if God grew tired of hearing soldiers beg for things already lost. When the hymn ended, he felt a hollow quiet heavier than the rain. Through that quiet came a movement at the doorway, a shadow in the light. A young woman stood there barefoot, drenched, clutching a torn Bible to her chest. Her hair clung to her cheeks, her eyes steady despite the chill. Henry recognized her from Whispers, the homeless girl who slept near the church steps. She looked like someone forgotten by the world, but remembered by heaven. The preacher welcomed all who sought shelter, yet no one offered a seat. The girl stood alone, dripping rain onto the wooden floor. Henry felt Eli tug his sleeve and point. The boy's wide eyes carried curiosity, not pity. Before Henry could react, Eli smiled and lifted his hand in greeting. The girl noticed and smiled back a soft, radiant expression that disarmed the room. She signed hello with careful fingers, and Eli's eyes lit with recognition. He answered her fluently, his gesture sure and bright. Henry froze, his breath caught in disbelief. Few people in town knew sign language, and none used it like that. When the service ended, folks drifted past her with polite discomfort. Henry lingered near the door, something tugging at his conscience. The girl thanked the preacher for the soup kitchen and turned to leave. Rain still poured outside, and she stepped into it without complaint. Eli pressed his small hand to the window, watching her disappear down the street. On the drive home, Henry kept his eyes fixed on the road. He told himself she was just another wanderer, young, lost, harmless, but her face lingered in his mind, calm and unafraid, like a hymn remembered too late. Eli hummed softly beside him, the soundless melody only he could feel. And somewhere beyond the clouds the church bell rang once more, this time louder. The rain eased to a whisper as the congregation spilled into the parking lot. Henry kept to the side with Eli, letting the crowd move past like a slow river. Talk of weather and crops floated in the damp air, familiar as Sunday pie. But Eli wasn't listening to faces. His eyes searched the church steps. There she stood barefoot, soaked, and somehow steady as a steeple. Her torn Bible looked older than she was, its pages fanned like a wounded bird. Water beaded along her lashes, but her gaze didn't flinch. When she noticed Eli watching, her features soft with quiet relief. She lifted one hand and signed a simple greeting. Eli brightened, shoulders squaring, spirit reaching before his feet could move. Henry felt something hitch in his chest, surprise, then a flare of protectiveness. Very few in town bothered to learn Eli's language, but the girl's hands moved with grace, careful and clear. "Hello. Your name? May I say friend?" Eli answered with a fluency that made Henry ache with pride. The pastor stepped over with a paper bowl from the soup kitchen. "Grace," he said kindly, "hot stew's inside if you want it." She thanked him, voice small but sure, and shook her head. "I'm all right, Reverend. Just needed a dry corner and a prayer." Henry turned at the name, filing it silently like a map point. Grace glanced toward the truck where Eli pressed a palm to the window. She signed slowly. "I like your drawing. You draw what you feel." Eli nodded and pulled a page from his pad flag, barn, a sunrise breaking rain. He held it to the glass as if offering a piece of himself. Grace's smile lifted the gray day like a match in a barn at dusk. People noticed, as they always did when kindness broke routine. A few muttered about strays and safety and letting boundaries slip. Others pretended not to see her bare feet on wet concrete. Henry heard the murmurs and felt old instincts rise like hackles. Protect the boy. Keep distance. Trust the rules that never saved you. Yet the way Grace stood humble, unwavering, did not read as threat. She looked past judgment as if it were fog, and she the bell inside it. Henry cleared his throat, meaning to usher Eli away. "Ma'am," he said, stiff but civil, storms moving on. "You got someplace to go?" Grace met his eyes with a steadiness that almost felt like prayer. "Nowhere that would miss me," she answered, not asking for pity. "Sometimes I sleep under the eaves. There's a hymn in the rain if you listen." The words unsettled him, too tender for a stranger, too true to ignore. Eli tugged his sleeve again, fingers spelling her name with shy certainty. Yah-Asi-E. Henry swallowed, feeling outnumbered by faith and a child's courage. He offered a nod that tried to say both yes and be careful. "If you're hungry, we've got bread at home." Grace shook her head, grateful, unassuming, then glanced at Eli. "Keep drawing," she whispered, as if the rain itself might carry it. Henry started the truck, the bell far behind still ringing in his bones. On the drive, the wipers beat time like a tired drummer. Eli cradled the sketch against his chest, eyes bright and distant. Henry told himself the day would settle back into chores and fences. But the image of the girl at the door refused to fade. Some thresholds, he knew, once crossed, never let a man return the same. By Monday the sky cleared to a clean Kentucky blue. Sun warmed the porch boards. The flag snapped with purposeful life. Henry set to chores hinges, feed, a stubborn patch of fence. Eli trailed him, sketchpad tucked under one arm like a secret. They worked in companionable silence, two shadows keeping pace. Near noon, a soft voice floated from the gate, careful not to startle. "Need a hand?" Grace asked, one palm raised, the other gripping her Bible. Her denim jacket was patched and sun-bleached, her smile plain as bread. Henry weighed habit against hospitality and stepped aside. "If you can hold a post steady, I won't say no." She worked without chatter, reading Henry's rhythm the way Eli did. When he stooped, she lifted. When he hammered, she braced the line. Eli brought nails like offerings, proud to be part of a team. The fence straightened, the field seemed to breathe easier. Work has a way of making strangers fit, at least for a while. Afterward they ate on the porch biscuits, apple butter, and cold milk. Grace thanked them, then asked if Eli might show her his drawings. He opened the pad, pages fluttering like flags in parade. She studied each with reverence, not pity, and signed, "You see truth." Eli's grin made the whole house brighter than noon. Henry kept a polite distance, watching from the rail. He had seen mercy used like a trap and charity like a leash. But Grace did not pull, did not prod. She simply met the boy where he stood. When she read aloud a psalm, her voice trembled but didn't break. Eli's fingers rested on the wood to feel the hum of each word. That night Henry sat alone beneath the flag, medals glinting in porch light. He took his son's folded uniform from the chair and held it close. Memory hit hard, the bugle, the folded triangle, the echo that never fades. Miracles died with the old stories, he muttered into the dark. Faith's what men cling to when the world won't give answers. He didn't realize she'd come back to return a borrowed hammer. Grace paused at the bottom step, the cross in her hands catching moonlight. "Miracles don't die," she said softly, not daring the porch without an invite. "They only die when hearts stop listening." The words hung like a flag finding wind after a long stillness. Henry bristled at being overheard, pride rising like a guard dog. He had earned his walls nail by nail and sorrow by sorrow. But Eli stepped into the doorway between them, small, brave, unafraid. He signed slowly. "She listens. Maybe God does too." Henry looked away, as if the fields might offer a simpler truth. Over the next days she came to feed the hens and read at dusk. Sometimes she prayed. Sometimes she only sat and watched the light. The town's talk grew louder, suspicion walking on familiar feet. Henry kept his jaw set and his answers short, a sergeant at perimeter. Yet he noticed how Eli slept easier, drawings warmer with color. One evening the sky bruised with oncoming storm. Lightning stitched the horizon, wind worrying the trees. Grace stood on the porch with them, hands folded around the cross. "If I may," she asked, "I'd like to pray for the boy." Henry's note rose to his lips and stayed there, trembling, unspoken. He searched the flag, as if stripes and stars might render judgment. Thunder spoke first, then the ache he'd stored since the funeral answered. He nodded once, a soldier's surrender, and stepped aside. Inside, the house seemed to hold its breath as Grace knelt by Eli's bed. Henry remained standing, hat pressed to his chest like a vow. Her prayer was not loud, not polished, but it carried weight. She asked for mercy the way farmers ask for rain, honest, unpretending. Eli watched her lips, eyes luminous, fingers feeling the quilt's quiet tremor. Henry shut his eyes and found himself whispering with her despite himself. Somewhere beyond thunder, an old bell tolled a memory, a promise, a door. He opened his eyes to the storm glass shaking and the lamp flicker. Grace finished softly and rose, pale but peaceful. "Thank you," she whispered, more to God than to him. Henry couldn't speak around the stone in his throat. The farm fell still, listening for what might come next, and believing enough to wait. The afternoon sky dimmed to the color of pewter, clouds gathering like soldiers on the ridge. Henry felt it in his bones before the first thunder cracked across the valley. The wind whipped through the pasture, bending grass like ocean waves. Eli stood by the window, his small hand pressed to the glass, watching lightning split the sky. Henry moved to close the shutters, muttering that storms always came when things felt steady. That night the rain arrived in sheets, fierce and unrelenting. The old farmhouse creaked under the pounding of wind and water. Henry checked the locks, fed the stove, and called for Eli to come to bed. But the boy didn't move, his face pale, his lips trembling. He was burning up, his small body shivering despite the heat. Henry's heart lurched with the same helplessness he'd known in combat. He lifted Eli into the truck, rain soaking his coat as he drove through flooded roads. The clinic lights flickered through the storm, sterile and cold. The doctor, calm and clinical, repeated the same tired words. "He'll live, Mr. Miller, but he'll never hear. You need to accept that." The drive home felt longer than the war itself. Lightning flashed across the wet windshield, blinding and merciless. Henry gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. When he reached the farm, Eli was half asleep, fevered, murmuring something in dreams. Henry whispered, "You rest now, son," but his voice cracked like an old hinge. As he carried Eli inside, a figure stood waiting at the porch. Grace, drenched from the storm, clutched a wooden cross worn smooth by years of prayer. She looked at him, not with fear, but with the calm of someone sent. "I found this behind the church," she said softly. "Thought maybe you'd need it tonight." Henry stared at her, thunder rumbling in reply. "I don't need trinkets," he snapped, pain bleeding through the words. Grace didn't move. "Then pray with me," she said. "If you've got nothing left to lose." Her tone wasn't pleading, it was conviction, steady and unbroken. Henry's chest tightened. The weight of years pressed down like armor. Outside, lightning struck the hilltop oak, splitting it clean in two. He almost told her to leave to let him drown in his own disbelief. But Eli stirred and signed her name in weak, trembling hands. Grace stepped closer, eyes wet, holding the cross out between them. The storm raged louder, rain hitting the roof like gunfire, and in that chaos, Henry finally nodded. They knelt beside the boy's bed, wind howling through the cracks. Grace began to pray words raw, trembling, desperate. Henry tried to follow, but his throat closed around every syllable. So he listened instead, the sound of her faith, the rhythm of her tears. For the first time in years, he was not alone before God. Eli's small fingers clutched Henry's sleeve. The boy's breath steadied as Grace whispered, "Let your heart hear, even when your ears cannot." Henry's tears fell freely, mixing with the storm's fury outside. Something shifted in the air, a calm at the eye of chaos. And for a fleeting second, Henry thought he felt heaven draw near. Dawn came soft and trembling, the world washed clean by the night. The farmhouse smelled of rain and candle wax, the storm finally gone. Eli slept peacefully, his hand still curled around Henry's finger. Grace sat by the window, soaked clothes steaming near the stove's warmth. She looked exhausted, but her eyes carried something bright, something unbroken. Henry rose quietly, his knees stiff from the long vigil. He poured 2 cups of coffee, handed one to her without a word. "Thank you," she said, voice small against the morning hush. He wanted to tell her it was pointless, that prayers couldn't fix what God ignored. But the words caught on his tongue like splinters. Grace set her cup down and faced him. "Faith doesn't always heal the body," she said, her tone steady. "Sometimes it heals the people around it." Henry scoffed softly, shaking his head. "And what would you know about that?" Her eyes lowered for a moment, the firelight glinting off the cross. "I know what it's like to lose someone and keep praying anyway." Outside, mist rose from the wet grass, turning the world ghost-like and still. Eli stirred, blinking awake, his cheeks flushed, but color returning. Grace smiled and brushed his hair back, humming a tune no one else could hear. The boy's eyes widened. He reached toward her as if feeling the melody. Henry froze his breath shallow, disbelief tightening every muscle. Grace looked up, seeing his fear before he spoke it. "Don't," he said hoarsely. "Don't give me false hope." Her gaze softened, unwavering. "Hope isn't false, Mr. Miller. It's faith that refuses to die." The clock ticked, thunder long gone, but its echo still in their hearts. Then Eli signed a single word, her name. Henry stared, the air thick with something between awe and denial. The boy repeated it, fingers trembling but sure. Grace smiled through tears, whispering, "He remembers me." Henry's legs felt weak. He sank to the chair, covering his face. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds, a single beam finding the flagpole. For the first time in years, Henry bowed his head, not in defeat, but in surrender. Grace knelt beside him, both of them wordless before what they couldn't explain. The house felt lighter, the silence different, alive somehow. Eli watched them, calm and curious, as if he understood more than either of them. The boy reached out, placing his small hand over theirs. When Grace finally stood to leave, the world seemed to hold its breath. Henry followed her to the porch, the wet boards glowing in morning light. "Why help us?" he asked quietly. "You don't even know us." Grace smiled, her voice trembling but sure. "Because someone once prayed for me when no one else did." She stepped into the mist, the wooden cross catching one last spark of dawn. Henry watched her walk down the long dirt road until she disappeared. Then he looked at Eli alive, breathing, radiant with something he couldn't name. He whispered to himself, "Maybe faith ain't about asking ... Maybe it's about listening." The words surprised him, but they felt true. And somewhere in the distance the faint ring of a church bell answered. Evening drifted, and slow and golden, the storm now a memory whispered through dripping leaves. Grace returned quietly, as if carried by that same hush of calm. Henry met her on the porch, not with suspicion this time, but with the quiet weight of hope. Eli played in the yard, his laughter soundless yet brighter than the sunset behind him. The flag above them stirred faintly, its edges drying in the dusk light. Inside, the house glowed with lamplight and the soft crackle of the stove. Grace read aloud from her worn Bible while Eli watched her lips move. He mimicked her words silently, tracing soundless syllables into the air. Henry listened not to her voice, but to the steady rhythm of faith in motion. Every word seemed to echo somewhere deeper than the ear could reach. Then something changed so small at first it could have been imagination. Eli's hand twitched, then his head tilted sharply, eyes wide with confusion. He blinked, lips parting, as though the world itself had startled him awake. Grace stopped reading, her voice catching in her throat. Henry leaned forward, his heart pounding louder than thunder. Eli touched his ear and frowned, trembling as he turned toward his grandfather. The air thickened, time slowing, stretching, holding its breath. Then, like a spark striking dry wood, came the sound, a small broken word, rough but unmistakable. Grandpa. The silence that followed was louder than any storm. Henry froze. For a moment he thought his mind had betrayed him, but Grace's tears confirmed what his heart already knew. Eli said it again, clearer this time, voice trembling but real. Henry's knees buckled as he dropped beside the boy, clutching him tight. Years of disbelief cracked open like a dam under pressure. Grace knelt beside them, her hands trembling around the wooden cross. "Thank you," she whispered through tears that fell freely, unashamed. The lamp flickered as if the whole room exhaled. Outside the wind died, leaving only stillness holy, endless, alive. In that stillness Henry heard more than sound. He heard mercy. He pulled back, studying Eli's face as though seeing him for the first time. The boy laughed an unsteady, miraculous sound that filled the farmhouse. Henry's chest broke open with sobs, decades of silence pouring out at once. He looked to Grace, speechless, his mouth trembling around gratitude. She only nodded, whispering, "He can hear." But maybe we all just did. Later, as the fire dimmed, Henry sat awake, the world utterly changed. He could still hear Eli breathing softly in the next room, his favorite sound now. Grace sat across from him, eyes red but bright with peace. Henry's voice cracked when he finally spoke. "I saw a lot of battles, Miss Miller, but none like this." Grace smiled gently, brushing a tear from her cheek. "Every battle of faith leaves scars you can't see," she said. Henry nodded, staring at the flag folded on the shelf. For once, it didn't feel like mourning, it felt like promise. And outside, the church bell rang again, faint but clear, carried by the wind. The next morning dawned bright and cold. Sunlight spilling over wet fences and glistening grass. Henry stood on the porch with his coffee, listening to the new sound of life inside the house. Eli was humming clumsy, loud, off-key, but perfect in every way. Every note seemed to turn the air golden. For the first time in a decade, Henry found himself smiling without trying. But miracles don't stay secret long in a small Kentucky town. By noon, the story had raced from the grocery to the gas station, from porches to pews. The preacher called it a blessing beyond reason. The doctor called it an impossible misdiagnosis. And by sunset, half the town was at the gate wanting to see the boy who could now hear. Reporters came with cameras and questions, their boots sinking into the muddy road. Neighbors peeked through fences, whispering theories and fears. Grace stayed inside, frightened by the sudden noise her miracle had made. Henry met the visitors with guarded politeness, his pride wrapped in quiet defiance. "Believe what you will," he said. "I was there. That's enough for me." Still, doubt traveled faster than truth. Some claimed Grace was a con artist looking for fame. Others said hypnosis or tricks or coincidence. The doctor issued statements, warning people not to confuse faith with fact. Henry could feel the tide of suspicion rising like another storm. The church tried to keep peace, but even pews have fault lines. Reverend Cole stood firm, saying, "I saw faith heal that boy, and I won't apologize for it." But the board whispered of liability, of reputation, of public image. By midweek, they asked Grace to stop visiting the farm. Their words were polished, but their fear was plain. Grace agreed quietly, her hand shaking as she packed her few belongings. "I never wanted attention," she told Henry, eyes brimming with exhaustion. "I just wanted him to hear something good in this world." Henry clenched his jaw, anger and heartbreak warring inside him. "Seems folks don't know a miracle unless it fits their comfort," he muttered. Eli refused to let her go without goodbye. He ran to her, threw his arms around her waist, and whispered her name aloud. The sound broke her composure, tears spilling as she held him close. "Keep listening," she said softly, "not just with your ears." Then she turned and walked away, her cross swinging gently at her side. Henry watched her vanish down the same road she'd first appeared on. The flag above him rustled in the wind, a salute, a farewell, a promise. The farmhouse felt quieter that evening, but not empty. Inside, Eli's voice filled the rooms again, soft and clumsy and beautiful. And though Henry's faith had been shaken by many storms, this time it held. That night, as crickets hummed outside the open window, Henry prayed aloud. His words were rough, uneven, but true. "Thank you," he whispered, "for letting an old fool hear again, too." The sound of his grandson's laughter answered from the next room, and the house, once silent, finally learned how to sing. By week's end, the miracle had outgrown the town. A white van from Lexington pulled up the drive to Doctors, clipboards in hand. They wore pressed coats and professional disbelief. Henry greeted them on the porch, his posture straight as in his service days. Eli watched from the window, humming quietly to himself. Inside, the doctors ran test after test, wires and beeping machines replacing prayer. Eli obeyed their instructions with shy patience, repeating words they never thought he'd say. "Grandpa, flag, thank you." Each syllable carried pride that no stethoscope could measure. But the doctors only frowned, taking notes with clinical detachment. When the tests ended, the younger one finally spoke. "Medically speaking, this kind of recovery is impossible. You must understand." Henry leaned forward, voice calm but edged. "Son, I've lived through 3 wars. I know what impossible looks like, and this ain't it." The doctor's smile was thin, patronizing, the kind that says we know better. They left behind pamphlets and warnings about false hope. One even suggested therapy for psychological dependence on faith narratives. Henry followed them to their van, every muscle in his jaw locked tight. "You can take your papers," he said, shoving them into the man's chest. "But you'll never take what I heard with my own ears." The next morning a letter arrived from the hospital board. It warned Henry not to spread unverified medical claims. He laughed bitterly, the sound echoing through the empty kitchen. Grace's absence felt heavier now, her name still whispered like a secret. Eli traced words from a newspaper headline, "Faith Hoax Divides County." Henry tore the paper in half, the fragments fluttering like wounded birds. He thought of the folded flag in his living room, the medals that once meant truth. What good were ribbons if a man couldn't defend what was right? He strapped on his boots and grabbed his old army cap. It was time, he decided, to march again, this time for something unseen. That evening, Henry and Reverend Cole stood before the congregation. Cole read from the gospel about blind men who were made to see. Henry took the pulpit after him, hands trembling but voice steady. "Doctors can test the ear," he said, "but only faith can test the heart." The crowd fell silent, some inspired, others uneasy. Outside, lightning flashed in the distance, faint but threatening. The storm of doubt was coming back for round 2. Henry knew what it meant to stand outnumbered and unarmed, but he also knew the sound of truth when it called his name, and this time he wasn't going to let it be silenced. By Monday morning, the whispers had sharpened into blades. Posters appeared overnight, anonymous words scrawled in red. False prophet. Someone pinned one to the church door, another to Henry's gate. The radio hosts called it the Kentucky healing scandal. Grace Miller had become a ghost story, half saint, half sinner. The board summoned Reverend Cole to clarify doctrine and protect reputation. He refused to recant, saying only, "I serve truth, not comfort." That night, the board voted to suspend him indefinitely. Half the congregation cheered. The other half wept in the pews. The small-town church had turned into a battlefield without guns. Henry drove to town, his jaw set, heart pounding with old fury. He found Grace sitting outside the diner, suitcase at her feet, waiting for a bus. Her hair was tucked beneath a cap, her Bible bound tight with twine. "Leaving?" he asked, though he already knew. Grace nodded, eyes rimmed red. "Seems faith makes folks nervous." He sat beside her, the old truck idling at the curb. "They're wrong about you," he said, voice breaking on the last word. Grace smiled faintly. "They're not wrong about me being broken, Mr. Miller. They're wrong thinking God won't use broken things." Her words were soft, but they cut deeper than any insult could. Eli ran from the truck before Henry could stop him. He threw himself into her arms, clinging tight as if he knew this was goodbye. "Don't go," he whispered, voice shaking but clear. Grace kissed his forehead, whispering back, "Miracles don't stay where they're comfortable." She looked up at Henry, pleading, not for herself, but for his faith. When the bus pulled up, its brakes hissed like the sigh of a tired world. Grace stepped aboard, her cross glinting in the weak sunlight. Henry stood still, hat in hand, heart hollow. The door closed with a thud that felt final, eternal. The bus vanished down the road, taking the calm with it. The town grew colder after that day. Gossip turned to doctrine, and doctrine turned to law. Children whispered her name like myth. Adults spat it like curse. The pastor's house stayed dark, its windows empty of song. Only the farmhouse on Miller's Hill still spoke her name in prayer. That night, Henry found her cross lying on the porch left behind, or perhaps returned. He turned it over in his hands, the wood warm as if still held in prayer. Eli slept soundly upstairs, the faint hum of a lullaby escaping his lips. Henry looked at the sky, heavy with clouds, and whispered, "She gave us hearing. Now give me strength." Somewhere beyond the fields a bell rang once, clear and defiant. He didn't know if it came from town or from heaven itself, but he stood at attention, saluted the sound, and let the tears fall. The night was long, but for the first time his heart didn't feel empty. Grace was gone, but her echo remained. And in that echo, Henry began to understand that faith never really leaves, it just moves on. The bus was long gone, and with it the hush that felt like shelter. Days thinned into a quiet that didn't comfort, only lingered. Eli spoke less, then not at all, as if guarding a fragile flame. He sat on the porch steps at dusk, eyes fixed on the flag. It waved like a hand he could no longer quite grasp. Henry tried every small mercy. He knew chores, stories, prayer. The words tasted like dry bread, familiar but hard to swallow. Eli's drawings turned spare again. Horizon, fence a single star, music boxes of color closed back into careful lines. The farmhouse learned the old stillness it once feared. One evening, wind shuffled leaves like pages in a hymn book. Henry found the wooden cross resting on Eli's pillow. Beside it, a folded note in an unsteady hand. He opened it slowly, breath held the way soldiers do. "Faith doesn't end when the proof fades," the note read. The words cut and healed in the same heartbeat. They felt like orders and mercy, both at once. Henry sat on the bed and let himself be still. He had measured life by outcomes, not obedience. Maybe hearing was gift, but listening was command. He remembered Grace kneeling, not performing but surrendering. Remembered Eli's first broken "Grandpa," bright as sunrise. He remembered how the house breathed different that night, not quiet or truer, as if walls could finally exhale. Truth had entered by a door no doctor could find. Henry placed the cross on the mantel above his medals. Steel and wood, service and surrender side by side. He stood at attention without meaning to, spine straight. A saluted promise to the unseen that had carried them. Then he whispered, "I hear you," into the gathering dark. Eli climbed onto the porch swing and watched the field. Crickets stitched evening together in their hidden choir. He did not speak, but he listened with his whole body. To flag, to fence, to far-off bell in the mind. Silence felt less like absence, more like waiting. Henry sat beside him, saying nothing loud or brave. He let the boy lean into the shape of his arm. Sometimes love is simply weight that doesn't move. Sometimes faith is staying when answers don't. The swing creaked like an old hymn that still remembered. That night the house did not reclaim the old despair. It held the crosslight in corners and along the stairs. Henry prayed without bargaining, only gratitude for breath. He asked for courage to hear without proof or promise. Outside the flag found wind, and the wind found them. Morning rose in a quiet the heart could bear. Eli ate in peace, then traced the word hope on steam. Henry didn't correct the shaky letters. He saluted them. The day ahead would ask for endurance, not spectacle. He felt ready to stand where truth had been spoken. Sunday came with a sky scrubbed clean and bright. The white clapboard church glowed like a kept promise. Henry buttoned his coat with hands that didn't shake. Eli stood tall beside him, quiet but steady. They drove the gravel road, as if called by name. Inside, voices rustled like papers before a verdict. Reverend Cole's chair sat empty, a silence everyone felt. The board began a careful sermon about order and caution. Henry listened until his jaw found its old steel. Then he rose, hat in hand, and walked the aisle. He did not wait to be recognized or invited. He faced the congregation the way soldiers face weather. "My name is Henry Miller," he said, voice plain. "I fought 3 wars and buried my son under a flag." His words found timber and beams and hearts alike. "I've seen what men call impossible," he continued. "Seen boys stand when they should have fallen." He looked at Eli, then to the empty pulpit. "I heard my grandson say 'Grandpa' with my own ears. And I learned faith isn't blind, it's brave." A murmur moved like wind through wheat. Some lowered their eyes. Others lifted their chins. Henry held the wooden cross high enough to catch light. "This ain't magic, and it ain't a lie. It's mercy. And mercy does not ask permission." He named his son, and the day the bugle cried. Named the doctor's pamphlets, and the word impossible. named Grace Miller, a soldier of faith, without apology. Named the fear that dresses up as prudence in church clothes. Truth, when named, stood upright and would not sit. Sun slipped past a cloud and poured the room in gold. Dust lit like a slow snowfall over bowed heads. Someone began to weep. Someone else began to hum. Knees found floorboards the way roots find water. Henry did not press. The light did that work. He set the cross on the altar beside the open Bible. Science and faith can shake hands, he said, but only one can teach a heart to listen. If you want order, keep your rules. If you want life, make room for grace. At the back, a child whispered, "Amen," not knowing why. At the front, an old farmer stood, and then another. Hands reached for hands across pew lines of habit. The empty chair of Reverend Cole seemed less empty. Church felt less like argument, more like home. Henry stepped aside and let the room decide. He had not come to win, only to witness. Eli slipped his hand into his grandfather's palm. Their silence spoke what words would only crowd. Outside the flag lifted, catching a holy wind. When they walked back down the aisle, no one stopped them. Some nodded, not to men, but to the sound of truth. Henry tipped his hat to the cross and the light. He did not feel victorious, he felt heard. And in that hearing the town began to listen too. He held the door for those who needed time. On the steps he looked over the valley of his life. The bell did not ring, yet the air felt wrung. Eli smiled up at him and mouthed, "Grandpa, sure." Henry answered, "I'm here, and meant it for heaven too." The road into town shimmered beneath summer light, the dust soft as memory. Henry drove slow, the truck's engine humming a tune older than forgiveness. He wasn't looking for anything, yet his eyes searched the horizon. Weeks had passed since Grace vanished, but her absence filled every corner. Even the wind seemed to whisper her name across the fields. Then he saw her small figure walking the shoulder of the road, backpack slung low. Her denim jacket was faded, her hair tangled by miles of prayer and rain. Henry stopped before thinking, boots crunching gravel as he stepped out. "Need a ride?" he asked, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. Grace smiled faintly. "I'm walking with faith, Mr. Miller. It gets me where I'm going." Eli leapt from the truck before Henry could answer, shouting her name. The sound clear, joyous, unbroken cut through the still morning like bird song. Grace froze, hands covering her mouth as tears filled her eyes. He ran to her, small arms wrapping around her waist with childlike certainty. "That's all the thanks I'll ever need," she whispered, holding him close. Henry approached slowly, the weight of guilt and pride heavy as armor. "I should have fought harder for you," he said. "Should have trusted more, doubted less." Grace looked up, eyes shining through her tears. "You did fight," she said. "You just forgot who you were fighting for." He nodded, humbled, words lost beneath the sound of grace itself. They sat beneath a maple tree at the edge of the road. Eli sketched while Grace hummed softly, a tune that carried peace instead of pain. Henry watched the two of them, seeing past circumstance to something eternal. He'd spent a lifetime learning to command men, not moments like this. But this was victory of another kind. When they returned to the farm, the world seemed new again. The flag waved steady, unafraid, its colors deepened by sun and time. Grace walked through the house, tracing the cross on the mantel. Eli followed close, his laughter threading through the rooms like music. Henry whispered to himself, "Home's louder when the right hearts fill it." That night they sat on the porch as fireflies blinked like shy stars. Grace spoke of the shelters she'd helped rebuild, the prayers she'd carried for strangers. Henry listened, realizing she'd never belonged to one town or one miracle. She belonged to faith itself, moving, unrooted, enduring. And he felt honored just to have crossed her path again. Before sleep, Grace looked toward the valley and murmured, "Thank you." Henry didn't ask if she meant him or God or both. Some gratitude needs no direction. It only needs release. Eli leaned against his grandfather's shoulder, eyes heavy with peace. The world, for one quiet evening, felt whole. The next week, the churchyard buzzed with hammers, laughter, and redemption. Henry stood beside Reverend Cole, blueprint spread across an old Bible. "We'll rebuild it," he said. "For her and for what she taught us." The Reverend nodded, eyes wet behind his glasses. "The bell will ring again," he said. So the world remembers to listen. The new tower rose slow but proud, each plank cut with reverence. Neighbors came with tools and casseroles, atonement in their hands. No one mentioned the rumors. The work itself was confession enough. Even the skeptics lifted beams, their silence saying what pride could not. Grace watched from the fence line, smiling through quiet tears. When the tower stood finished, Henry engraved a single verse at its base. "Blessed are those who believe without seeing." He traced each word with the steadiness of a soldier and the softness of a father. Beside it he carved her name, Grace Miller, simple and eternal. The wood gleamed under sunlight, like it had been waiting for her all along. Eli tugged his sleeve, pointing toward the rope that hung from the bell. "Can I?" he asked, eyes wide with both joy and fear. Henry nodded, stepping back as Grace placed her hand over the boy's. Together they pulled the first note, trembling through the valley. It wasn't loud, but it was pure, like forgiveness finding its echo. The sound rolled over fields and rooftops, over doubt and disbelief. People paused in their chores, heads lifting to listen. For miles the bell's voice reached hearts that had forgotten how to hope. Children ran to the churchyard, laughing, hands over their ears. Eli cried not from pain, but from wonder. Grace knelt beside him, brushing away tears that were more light than sorrow. "You hear it?" she asked softly. He nodded, still trembling. "It's beautiful." Henry turned away, hiding his own tears behind calloused hands. He'd faced bullets, storms, and funerals, but never a moment like this. The whole town gathered, faces shining with shared awe. Even the doubters couldn't help but smile when the bell rang again. It sounded like homecoming, like unity, like something higher remembered. Reverend Cole prayed aloud, voice breaking mid-verse. "This town was deaf, Lord, but now we listen." As dusk fell, the tower stood tall against the amber sky. The flag atop the church rippled beside the bell's silhouette. Henry looked up, hand over his heart, whispering, "We did it, kid." Grace smiled beside him, her expression a mixture of joy and departure. Somewhere inside the ringing, they both heard God's answer. That night, the valley glowed with lanterns and laughter. Families lingered long after the final chime. Grace slipped away quietly, her shadow fading down the road. Henry didn't follow. He knew some missions keep moving. and above them the bell kept singing into the night. Autumn rolled across Kentucky in gold and fire, painting the hills with memory. The fields that once whispered loss now hummed with life again. The bell tower gleamed in morning light, the flag beside it proud and steady. Every ring carried the sound of a promise kept, and beneath that sound the Miller farm had learned how to live again. Henry moved slower these days, but with purpose in every step. He rose with the dawn, coffee steaming beside an open Bible. Eli, now strong and curious, followed him through chores and prayer. The boy laughed often, loud and free, never tiring of his own voice. To Henry, every laugh was proof that heaven remembered. Sometimes when the wind came down from the hills, Henry swore he heard her. Grace's voice, soft, steady, carried in the hum of the fields. He'd stop his work, tip his hat toward the horizon, and listen, not for words, but for the quiet between them, because that's where miracles had always lived. One crisp morning, he and Eli walked to the tower together. The town had gathered for the first Veterans Prayer Service since the rebuilding. Families brought flowers, school children held flags too big for their hands. The pastor spoke of faith and courage, but Henry heard something deeper. He heard unity and old hymns sung by hearts instead of choirs. When the ceremony ended, Eli climbed the steps to the bell. He wrapped his small hands around the rope and waited for his grandfather's nod. Henry saluted, tears catching in the sunlight. Eli pulled the bell rang, proud and clear, across the valley. The sound swept through the crowd like the wind through wheat. Henry looked around and saw faces lifted, eyes shining. Neighbors once divided now stood shoulder to shoulder again. Children laughed, old soldiers saluted, mothers held their sons. The sound of that bell was America itself, faith surviving doubt, hope after hardship. And in the middle of it all, Henry felt peace finally land. That evening, back on the porch, he took out paper and pen. He began a letter he had owed for years to the son he'd buried under that same flag. "Your boy can hear now," he wrote slowly, the ink trembling. "And so can I." He sealed it with a sigh that sounded like prayer. Eli sat beside him, tracing the edges of the flag in fading light. "Grandpa," he said softly, "what's the bell for?" Henry smiled, voice low but sure. "It's to remind us, son, that this land listens when we do." The boy nodded, and the porch fell into a peaceful silence. As night deepened, the wind carried the bell's echo down the valley. It rolled past barns and churchyards, over roads that never forget their dust. Each chime felt like a heartbeat, steady and eternal. Grace's cross hung near the doorway, catching a last glint of starlight. And Henry whispered, "Thank you for letting America keep its faith." The camera of the world would fade on that porch, 2 generations, 1 legacy. A flag waving, a bell ringing, a nation remembering how to believe. For in a land built on courage and grace, even silence speaks if you listen. The narrator's voice carried the final truth home. In a country of hearts that still kneel, sometimes the loudest miracles are born from silence.